So here we are, Dan and Brendan, once again talking about current events, and the big topic right now, it seems to have, even Dan, to have eclipsed coronavirus for the time being, and understandably so, is the situation with George Floyd, who was killed, obviously, by a police officer, and the protests that have erupted since. We thought that we would post a video trying to explain in the simplest terms possible the Minnesota law that's being applied here. So I think the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and lay out the 3 different degrees of murder in Minnesota. Minnesota, like most states, has 3 different kinds of murder. Now, there are more kinds of homicide. Homicide includes murder, manslaughter, negligent homicide, other things like that. Homicide is the killing of a human being. Murder, of course, is the worst kind of homicide. And most states have 3 kinds of murder. Minnesota happens to call them 3 different degrees of murder. So of the 3 types of murder you generally find in most states, there are 2 that involve specific intent and 1 that doesn't. Specific intent is a legal term of art. It's important to understand that terminology. It's possible to intend an act, and it's possible to intend a consequence. And specific intent means not just the intent to do the act, but intent to cause the consequence. So for example, I can shoot somebody without intending to kill them. I can punch somebody without intending to kill them. Or I can shoot somebody with the intent that the result of the shooting be that the person die. So specific intent murder requires not just that I intended, in this case, right, not that just that the officer intended to kneel on Mr. Floyd's neck, but specific intent would mean that the prosecutor would have to show that the police officer intended that kneeling on Mr. Floyd's neck would result in Mr. Floyd's death. That's how specific intent works. Now, as to the 2 types of specific intent murder, 1 involves premeditation and 1 doesn't. So if you specifically intend to kill somebody and it's by plan or design, you set out to do it, that is first-degree murder in Minnesota. On the other hand, if you specifically intend to kill somebody, so you want them dead, but you did not plan to do it in advance, it wasn't a plan or scheme that you executed, it was essentially an impulse killing or an intent to kill that developed in the course of the act of killing. That would be second-degree murder in Minnesota. So first degree is, if you look at the elements here, first degree is specific intent to kill plus planned it, premeditation. Second-degree murder is specific intent to kill without premeditation. Third-degree murder in Minnesota tracks pretty well what the law in other states as well. And third-degree murder is what lawyers used to call depraved heart murder. Now in Minnesota, it's called depraved mind. And what that kind of murder reflects is not a specific intent to kill, but rather a complete, you got to listen to these words when you're thinking about the appropriate charge in this case, right? The complete indifference on the part of the accused to the value of human life. In other words, we're talking about, under third-degree murder, depraved mind murder in Minnesota, the creation of an extreme risk of death under circumstances where it looks like the accused didn't care whether he killed somebody or not, right? The accused, this is the way I used to explain depraved heart murder in class. This is the kind of person who, if they killed somebody today, they'll go to bed and sleep peacefully. If they didn't kill somebody today, they'll go to bed and sleep peacefully. It doesn't matter to them. That's depraved heart or depraved mind murder. And Dan, that is the degree of murder for which Derek Chauvin or Chavin or whatever his name is, frankly, I don't care if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Third-degree murder is what he was charged with. And you and I have been discussing that not from a moral or political or philosophical standpoint, but from a legal standpoint, it may be time for states to reform their laws so that third-degree murder becomes first-degree murder, or that they incorporate maybe some type of provision for when somebody of authority uses their authority to kill somebody. Maybe that should bump up the degree of murder. But under the law as it stands in Minnesota, it would be difficult for a prosecutor to charge, more difficult, I should say, not impossible, more difficult for a prosecutor to charge first or second degree murder, because those are the specific intent types of murder.
So it's important, I think, Brendan, for us to spend a minute or two and make sure that the people who are watching this understand our goal here, which is simply stated to explain the state of Minnesota law and why we think the prosecutor charged third-degree murder. Our purpose here is not to sort of offer any opinion as to the moral correctness or the moral propriety of what's going on. In fact, we had a lengthy conversation before we started recording this, and it's unfortunate that this can't be a murder one type of situation, simply because the prosecutor has a huge hill to climb with the elements of specific intent and premeditation.
And that begs the question whether the law is upside down a little bit and has not adapted and evolved with society and with times. I mean, when you think about, we can all agree, again, that if the law were drafted perfectly, and again, if it reflected the moral code that has come to develop, if the law were drafted perfectly, we would have a first-degree murder charge. But in the way it is drafted, a first-degree murder charge would be difficult because, again, you'd have to prove that the officer, that there was a plan or scheme to kill before the killing happened. It would be possible, at least theoretically, to charge second-degree murder, especially when you look at some of the facts floating around about how long the officer had his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck, the possibility that Mr. Floyd was unresponsive for 2.5 or more minutes, and even that another officer checked the pulse. To the extent that you can prove that happened at some time during that continuum of those 9 minutes, certainly it would be possible to infer that at some point he developed the intent to kill Mr. Floyd. But again, that would be difficult to prove. What's not going to be difficult to prove, especially with the racial undertones and overtones and undertones of this, is that the officer completely disregarded the value of Mr. Floyd's life. But as I say, maybe we're upside down because who's the more dangerous person, right? Dan, you and I have talked about this. Who's the more dangerous person in society? The person who would use his authority to kill and doesn't care? The person who kills without needing a reason to kill? Or the person who kills but only for a reason? And that sounds weird, but first-degree murder basically is the type of person, a first-degree murderer is a type of person who is going to have a reason to kill. A third-degree murderer has no reason to kill. And there is a legitimate debate about which one of those types of people is more dangerous. So again, maybe that should be first-degree murder, but it's not, right?
There are a couple of additional points that I think we might mention here. The first is that this is not the first time that this officer has found himself in trouble. I've read reports indicating that over the course of his 19 or 20 year career, he had 17, 18 reported incidents where there were allegations that he used excessive force, unnecessarily inflicted harm upon members of the community in the course and scope of doing his duties. So there is a history here that goes to the point of the degree of danger that an individual poses to society. I don't know how much of that comes in a trial of this case, but that certainly does seem like something that would be relevant in the question of what sort of charging decision that we make. The second point that I think bears mention is something that we've tried to talk about in the past, and that is the law does not exist in a vacuum. The Hennepin County prosecutor made a charging decision based upon the facts of the case and applicable Minnesota law. But there are clearly other factors at work here, and now I'm talking about political type of factors that are at work here that I think probably, if I'm sitting in the Hennepin County prosecutor's office, it gives me pause anyway. If I charge too much in this case, and we go to trial and lose this case at trial, it could be absolutely disastrous for the community. Almost certainly would be absolutely disastrous for the community. So I think that to some degree, amongst the authorities in the prosecutor's office, there was probably a fair amount of discussion as to what can we charge and be sure that when we walk out of court, we walk out of court with a conviction in hand. Does that make sense?
Yes. These are all, yeah, they're all sensitive topics, but they're topics that especially people who are concerned about the law and the legal system that have to be addressed. We have to talk about this stuff. So I think that was another great discussion. Just to kind of summarize, we hope that this short video helps people understand what are the elements that prosecutors are looking at in terms of the mental elements of the crime. And they're going to have to, again, there are the elements that you want to be concerned about. First degree murder is specific intent plus premeditation. And second degree murder is specific intent without premeditation. And then you have third degree murder, which does not require specific intent. It just requires a depraved heart or a depraved mind, somebody who doesn't care. There's probably no more dangerous creature on the planet than somebody in authority who doesn't care about the value of other people's lives that he is sworn, of course, to protect. So the open question is, number one, what charges are available? Number two, maybe for another day, is it time for some legal reform so that the degrees of murder in states like Minnesota better reflect the risks to society? Will that do for us as a summary, Dan?
I think that's a great summary, and that's probably where we should leave off with this one.
All right. We'll be back to talk about probably Donald Trump's misadventures here sometime in the near future.